Is it go? Hello, everyone. Well, hi. Welcome to the third session of Future of Mobile Summit from MEF. My name's Tim Green. I'm the features editor of MEF, and I'm happy to be moderating this next session on identity and authentication. Now, when I arrived at the session an hour or so ago, they scanned my pass, and a big red cross came up. And my immediate thought was, do you know who I am? And who the hell do you think you are? And I actually thought, because I've got a big ego and I'm very important, and I actually thought, well, actually, those are the two questions that kind of like hang over this very topic, because when transactions go digital and virtual, who you're dealing with and who you're buying from become very important questions which are not easy to solve. And when you don't solve them, they lead to fraud and privacy outrages and theft and digital identity theft and so on. So it's a massive topic and it's a difficult one to crack. Now, obviously, mobile, everyone has a mobile. Every mobile is unique. So the mobile kind of offers us a way forward. But as we know from the last session, mobile doesn't guarantee security, and then of course there's the question of user interface with passwords and multiple factors and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done, but there are people trying to solve this problem with all the great opportunities that go with it. And one of them is Andrew Budd, and he'll be giving the next session. He'll be doing the next presentation, and Andrew is CBE, and he's the global MEF chair, and is also the founder of iProve. So he's going to be doing a short presentation just to introduce this topic, and then we're going to have a Q&A, and we'll be joined by Lee Suka, who's the head of authentication and number information at Cinch. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew, and then we're going to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Now, the real challenge is, can we make this session so interesting that not one of you looks at your phone even once throughout the whole period? And I would wager that the answer will be yes, because this is by far the most interesting session in the day, and it's really, really, really important. Right. I want to talk in the next 5 minutes or so about on 4 topics. I want to talk about why we should care, why we should really care as businesses, and why this is getting more significant and more business critical. I want to talk about some of the fundamental issues, some of which are boiling up and making our task more difficult. I want to talk about authentication and what happens with the death of SMS. There you are, you see, you've stopped looking at your phones. And finally, I'm going to talk to you briefly about verifiable credentials, which is the next big thing for our industry in identity. Just where am I coming from, apart from being the global chair of the MEF since 2008 and on the board of this organization for 20 years. In 2012, I founded a business called iProve. We assure the genuine presence of users who are biometrically verifying themselves, and we do that for governments and banks worldwide. We are simply the strongest and most reliable and most usable way of doing biometric authentication on mobiles and other devices. Enough of a pitch. Now, up until now, the whole topic of identity authentication has really been on the topic of fraud. Everyone talks about it in the context of fraud. And the problem with fraud is that it's a manageable cost of doing business. The issue is that the way the world is going, the issues of identity, the business challenges to us all of authentication identity aren't about manageable business challenges. They're not about fraud. They're about much more serious things, in many cases societal threats, about which governments and regulators have a dwindling sense of humor. Mainly today, financing organized crime. People who can set up bogus accounts can use those accounts to launder millions and billions of dollars. The North Koreans probably financed their entire nuclear bomb program through money through accounts which were set up due to weak authentication. That's not a fraud problem, that's not a manageable business issue. Social impacts, we're seeing increasing psychological and political damage arising from completely untraceable and anonymous sources of information, including social accounts. in which information, misinformation, pornography, child exploitation is launched into cyberspace with no possibility of being able to reliably get back to the identities of the perpetrators. And when identity fraud takes place, yes, it's a manageable cost of doing business, but today, with so much of our lives are online, it can wreck people's lives for weeks and months, causing untold harm to people. And that's not a manageable cost of doing business. And finally, we're seeing that weak access control, weak authentication, which is responsible for 70% of cyber attacks, can destroy businesses and cost them billions of dollars of damage. It can take down their operations for months. It can require them to completely clean and rebuild their IT systems. That is a cost of doing business, but increasingly people understand it's not a manageable one, and increasingly it's not an insurable one. The word fraud never crossed my lips. Those are the sorts of things that need to be addressed when we're talking about identity and authentication. This is a much bigger topic than fraud. Let me talk about some of the key challenges that as an industry we face. Face, get the pun, face. Why do we say face is the root biometric today? Because in the world of digital identity is in the end just a set of facts about you. But at some point, those facts have to be bound to a human being, to a real, live, physical human being. And the only trusted way of doing that is to use government-issued ID. And the only biometric, the only thing on that government ID that tells you who you are is your face. So that means that the way that photo ID worldwide is set up, your face is the root biometric. There's a huge challenge going on because today there is a tremendous confusion between biometric verification, where you check that somebody looks like their photo ID, and biometric identification, where you spot them walking down the street having bought a present for somebody who wasn't their wife. This is a massive problem, and in the United States, at this moment, there is a rising momentum to ban face verification because people are frightened of face identification. That equivocation can cause immense damage to the whole mobile ecosystem. It clearly has to be addressed, meeting privacy concerns which are central to the future of this business. This is not unfamiliar to MEF. We've been talking about the importance of earning customer trust through managing privacy for over 10 years. The other thing that people worry about is that their face is going to get stolen. Well, you can't steal someone's face, at least not without a very strong scalpel. You can copy it, and therefore the key to the security of binding identities through faces is making sure that you can tell the difference between a real face, a real, genuinely present face, and a copy, including a deepfake copy. The industry generally is still coming to grips with this and is still worrying about stolen faces when people publish their faces on LinkedIn and Facebook all the time. We need to pivot towards an understanding that assuring the genuine presence of a face and protecting its copies is at the heart of the security of faces. And there is an increasing number of other options as well as the face for binding human beings to their identities, and we're probably going to talk about that in a second. Another challenge, which is an elephant in the room, many people in this room, many people in the MEF, many people at the show today are paying their staff salaries thanks to the revenues from SMS OTP transmission. SMS OTP has become a huge revenue source, and everybody knows that there are massive clouds gathering. In Singapore, they are removing it as a primary source because of fraud, and MEF has done its bit to try to limit that fraud. The next edition of NIST 863 will probably revert to the position they took a few years ago and say SMS OTP, because of security issues and SIM swap and various other things, is unacceptable. So what is the future of phone authentication? We'll talk about that. And what may be the second factor is the future. Will the phone always be the second factor or not? We will talk, I hope, about this issue that I mentioned at the first, that there is at the beginning, that there is a fundamental difference between identification, that is figuring out who a person is and authenticating them and making sure that they are whom they claim to be. It's an illusion that is a pandemic in our industry, and it's one that is extremely toxic to making progress, and one that we have to work our way through and understand how to solve differently. Finally, we have to, as an industry, get to grips with the next generation of digital identity. The future is not going to look like the past. That sounds like a geopolitical statement, and it's probably very true in geopolitics, but it's also true in the world of identity. That we are on the verge now of the rise of something called verifiable credentials, whose fundamental architecture doesn't look like it did before. What's going to cause this to happen is the European EIDAS-2 initiative, which is currently grinding its way through Brussels. There's a consultation going on at the moment, but we know that EIDAS-2, which will set the path for digital identity in Europe for the next 10 years, will not be based upon the old structures of centralized identity issuers. It's going to be based upon verifiable credentials. But there are huge questions. What's going to be the business model? Who's going to pay for what? What's the architecture of different suppliers? How are they going to fit together? What standards are going to be chosen? It's not that there are too few standards, but there are too many standards, and they're all having a brawl at the moment. Interestingly enough, those sorts of questions, business models, industry architecture, and standards, are exactly the challenges that MEF was created to solve, and that it has been so effective at solving over the last few years. And finally, there are some big questions, which are global questions, which is what will be the shape of digital identity worldwide. And it's going to extend from trust frameworks in which every business runs its own little digital identity scheme, and you've got a trust framework, which means there's kind of mutual recognition, all the way through to identities for life, where somebody wins the jackpot and issues you with the digital identity, and that is the digital identity that you use all the way through your life, that you have one identity issued by somebody very powerful, and you use it once and you never need to establish it again. This is a big difference. It's a political difference, it's a cultural difference. We're seeing the single identity model in places like Singapore, we're seeing trust frameworks in places like Australia and the UK, and they look fundamentally different from a business point of view. They have fundamentally different repercussions from a business point of view, from a technical point of view, from a risk point of view. It's going to make which way it goes is going to make a huge difference for all of us left in the room for this graveyard shift. And we're going to talk about them now, and with a bit of luck, Lee and I can find ways to argue about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. So we were talking before the session started that we're assuming that there's quite a few people in the audience who are quite new to this topic. So I want to kind of nail the fundamentals. And Lee, if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to stick with Andrew for a few minutes. You talked about the difference between identity and authentication there, and that really is massive, and it's quite frequently misunderstood. So can you just kind of lay out what that is and how it affects the way that we prove ourselves in real life?
Thank you, Jim. I'll try and keep it brief. To me, an identity is like a folder from a filing cabinet full of facts about you. It's like a dossier sitting on someone's desk with facts about you: your name, your date of birth, your address, your social security number, where you work. They're just facts about you. That's what a digital identity is. And it's useful because lots of people need at various points in your life and when you engage in transactions to know one or other of those facts about you, and therefore handing people bits or all of the data from that file can make life a lot simpler. It can be trusted, it removes data entry, but if the contents of that folder can be trusted, then the people who receive the information from that folder know that they're getting good data. That's a digital identity. But who does that folder belong to? It belongs to the person named in the folder, but the name is just another fact about you. Authentication is the moment at which I assert my right to the ownership of that folder. Because in the end, trust doesn't reside in folders or in phones. Trust resides with human beings, carbon-based life forms, as a senior official of the Department of Homeland Security likes to refer to us as. We're the people, it's what goes on inside our head that earns and loses trust. And so at some point you've got to bind that folder to the person. When a person asserts the information in that folder, you have to be able to trust that binding process. And it's that binding process that is authentication. Identity is what's in the folder. Authentication is what confirms my right to hand you that folder. And identification, well, there has to be a name on the front of the folder. There has to be something that says, This folder belongs to telephone number, emails, just something that distinguishes this folder from the other stack of folders on the table. That's it. But that's why, but oftentimes people get confused about the contents of that folder with the act of proving my right to assert it, and they can be completely disconnected.
Yeah, because, I mean, people talk about stealing your identity, but like everyone, you know, your email isn't private. You know, your home address isn't private. Your face isn't private. What's private, or should be, is your means of proving that that belongs to you. So that's the important thing. And, Andrew, just one more question for you. Now, I know this isn't going to be about iProve, and it's not an advert, but can you just tell us how it works? Because I think it gives a very good indication of one approach to solving this problem of identity.
Again, I'll try to keep it brief. This is not an advert, but it is but what we do is extraordinarily interesting and extraordinarily clever. So I'm afraid I'll struggle not to talk about it a bit. Our task, the bind, as I said, is the face. The face is not secret. Your face is completely public. So the attack on the face, when used to do that bind, is a copy. How do I know that I'm looking at a genuinely present human being, a real person there right now, rather than an artifact like a photograph or a screen or a mask, or something more insidious like a deepfake video that has been injected into the data stream? The way we solve, and it's got to be done usably. One of the great things about the mobile industry is that you learn that every click you ask someone to do, you lose 25% of them. So zero effort is fundamental, no torturing the customer. What we do is we illuminate the user's face with the screen of their device with a sequence of colors. That sequence is not predictable on the device. It's determined by our servers at the time of the authentication. So we illuminate the person's face with an unpredictable sequence of colors, and while that's happening, we stream video of their face back to our servers. There we have a look at how the light how the light reflects off their face. The way that it does it spatially and spectrally tells us whether we're looking at a three-dimensional, skin-covered, live, human face-shaped object or some weird artifact, and the sequence of colors has to be right, because if it's not right, we're looking at something that might be face-shaped, but it isn't there now. It's a socially engineered, stolen recording of the person, or it's a carefully architected deepfake, indistinguishable to the naked eye. These are the sorts of the attacks. The great thing about it is the user doesn't have to do anything. I look at my phone, it looks back at me, flashes at me for 2 or 3 seconds, and it's done. So it's incredibly usable. It's used by tens of millions of people worldwide. Over 1 million people iProved themselves at one day last year. Governments, health services, and banks worldwide use it. It is quite simply the most resilient, but also the most successfully usable method for assuring the genuine presence of a biometric face verification that there is. We do the authentication. As a matter of policy, we never know the identity of the user. That belongs to the manager of the dossier. We just compare the face, the genuinely present face, with a trusted reference, full stop.
And very, very quickly, how many attempts are there to hack your system every day?
Thousands. Right. Thousands. I think there have been periods in the last few weeks when we've had over 100,000 attacks a month.
Okay.
100,000 attacks a month. There are attackers who spent 4 or 5 months every day attacking the system. We run a security operations center, which means that we can analyze the attacks. We learn from them. We're not invulnerable. Anybody who ever says that they've got a perfectly reliable system is lying to you. Everybody gets hacked. The trick is everybody gets spoofed, rather. The trick is to have systems that detect those and learn from them. Yeah. So that you win an arms race, and it is an arms race. It is a real arms race. Using the information asymmetry, we learn more about the attackers every time they attack than they learn from us, and that's why they're smarter, they're richer, they're more numerous, they're more determined. Well, they're not more determined than we are, but we have an information asymmetry. By studying the way that they attack us, we continually evolve our system. Hundreds of thousands of times a month.
Oh, that's quite sobering. So anyway, Lee, thank you so much for waiting. We had a discussion before coming on stage about this, and you're obviously thinking very carefully about this in your role at Cinch. Yep. I know you've got an acronym, RAISE, which is a sort of you use as a shortcut for the way you think about this topic. Can you just share with the audience what that is?
Yes, I think Andrew painted a picture of a very strong security model. Maybe onboarding a digital ID with a government document and facial recognition. And, I don't criticize that. There's a time and a place, but I think we are in this room amongst the technical elite, whether we like it or not. And it's all too easy to think that every identity, every authentication needs to use the latest and greatest technology. So my career background, I started off in the defense industry, in security systems, and there were some fundamental principles, and that was, layered defenses, multi-factor authentication, and you can't operate in a world where you're using too many different types of technology. So RAISE was really then a bedrock that, if you've heard me speak before, that I use to help anyone in this identity space or authentication space think about their choices. So I use, this idea of RAISE to think about, well, how regular are you asking your end users to do something? If it's super regular, then they're going to be very happy to do something special for you because they'll become accustomed to it. But if it's once a month, or worse, once a 6 months or once a year, and you ask them to do something special, for sure they're going to forget how to do it, and then they're going to weaken your security model when they go back and press the reset process. The A is about audience. How big is your audience that you're trying to identify or authenticate? Because if it's huge, then there's going to be a very wide demographic. They're going to have access to different technologies, different skill sets. So you need to think about that. How important is it that you're trying to protect? If it's not important, then a low or medium level of assurance is okay. But if, I joke, if it's your crypto wallet, with 50 Bitcoins in, then maybe look elsewhere to SMS OTP, right? And, in some of the scenarios that Andrew will talk about, then a higher level of assurance is required. How much sway do you have? If you're a government and you can mandate that a certain technique is used or not, or you're an employer, then yeah, you might be able to download something. But if you're a consumer or it's a bring your own device in an employee situation, you're not going to have that level of control. And then the expertise of your user. I always use my family as the bar. I try to encourage them to use a password manager. Dad, you're mad. If I tried to get my wife to use a U2F key, she'd probably kill me. Right? So all of those things we need to take into account when we're thinking about identity, when we're thinking about authentication. And I just want to paint a slightly simpler version of identity. It's just a set of attributes that as an enterprise, they're willing to accept you as a unique individual. And they hand you back a credential. That credential might be your username, might be your email address, and you protect it with a password. Of course, we're all used to that. And when we type the username and password in, we get access to stuff that we want. But we need to think about the importance and value of that.
Okay, so given that, then what do you think is the current status of the one-time password by SMS, which is obviously something that Cinch probably is more use cases for Cinch customers than anything else. We've heard from the previous panel that there are all the flaws with that system. What's your thinking about it at the moment?
So I talk about level of assurance. Right? For low and medium risk situations, it's probably good enough. And I think about that idea of RAISE, where 5 billion people know how to use an SMS OTP. The SIM card is a crypto secure asset on our phone. Of course, SMS OTP is a proxy to proving possession of the SIM card. But given that everyone can use it, given the sheer reach, in many situations it's good enough. And I've had this question a few times on the stand today, and I've done a demo of it. So look, this is not an advert, but it's just to show you how good SMS is. So I've typed my number in here. This is an SDK. I click on initialize. 1, 2, under 4 seconds, this app has, bearing in mind I'm roaming, has received a message with a code in. It's automatically entered that code in a seamless experience, and I can probably be 95% plus sure it was me. Now, would I be happy to protect my Bitcoin wallet? I haven't got a Bitcoin wallet, by the way, and it hasn't got 100 Bitcoins in. You know, I'd probably be looking for a more secure method.
I suppose you would argue that, Andrew, that if you just, all you have to do is look at something and blink maybe, or just stare at something for 2 seconds, that's got a trump like waiting for a pass, as easy as it is to enter a one-time password, that your system's got to trump that. So that would kind of go against what Lee said. If Lee's saying you have to, you know, think about context, I'm sure you'd say, well, you don't need to worry about context. In every context, our system is simpler.
And when I founded iProve, I have to say that was exactly what I was thinking. You know, away were you to all these horrible passwords and these ghastly OTPs and having to receive an OTP number and copy and paste it. When we first started, people said, oh, this thing takes 8 seconds. That's a long time. I said, that's 8 seconds in which you don't have to do anything. Now time how long it takes to do an active OTP session, it takes 10 seconds and you have to do stuff. That's horrible. The world's moving on. Today, the standard strength is for protecting our users and our industries against attack is two-factor authentication. Not one, but two. So the days in which you could say, well, an OTP is good enough, or even a face is good enough, is kind of past. The today best practice says something you have, and or something you know, and or something you are. At least 2 out of 3 of those. So I do see a world in which we're going to be seeing both a device possession test like the successor to OTP, plus a face. And then the question is, how can we make sure that that process is as fast as possible and still maintain absolutely zero effort so that the conversion rates are high? You know, we run for us, the metric of how good our liveness detection is number of attempts to succeed. You know, if it's above 1.2, that's not so great. Most of our competitors are, we're not. That's an important number. I don't know what the number for SMS OTP is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't something greater than that. The big challenge, I think, is that if you do have a world in which you've got an app on people's phone, then there are alternatives to the OTP altogether. You can embed keys into the trusted environment, and suddenly who needs all this messing around with OTPs? You can do header enrichment lookups and other such things, which again look at the possession, whether you've got the phone, and there is a difference between whether you've got the phone and whether you are the user, and two-factor authentication brings those two together. So I think the answer is it's going to be a combination of what we do and what Cinch is going to do next.
And can I just ask you why you think the face is so dominant and the best solution? What's wrong with the fingerprint, with the vein, with the heartbeat, some of these other biometrics?
Because the face is unique, because it's the one biometric that you can detect, you can sense using the sensor that is on every single phone in the world. I mean, one of the great advantages of SMS OTP is that it'll work on absolutely every phone. Today, pretty every phone in the world has a front-facing camera, and all you need to do to do a biometric verification of a face is to have a front-facing camera. So the sensor is ubiquitous, and you can't say that about the fingerprints. Secondly, it's the one biometric that can effectively be processed in the cloud, and which you can effectively do the liveness detection of in the cloud. Fingerprints, irises, all these other things, they have to be done locally, and if they're done locally, you've handed your anti-forgery system to the forger. May take him a day, may take him 2 days, might take him a week, but he'll break it. The great beauty of the face is that the sensors are ubiquitous, the processing can be done in the cloud, and it's completely effortless. I just look at my phone, it looks back at me. It is completely passive, completely effortless. To use our system, you don't have to be able to read, which is actually pretty important. So it's the combination of the usability and the ubiquity and this third factor that I referred to earlier, which is that it links it is the only thing that links to government photo ID.
Andrew said earlier in his answer, was talking about some of the other attributes you can use from a phone or a SIM card to prove you are who you are, just not just the typing in the code you've been sent, but maybe your location or your phone use history and so on. This is a new idea which is gathering momentum. What do you think of that?
Well, I am going to answer that, but I'd like to answer something else first, because I know Andrew and I do disagree on this point, and I'm worried about the conflation here of digital identity with the need to prevent some of those hideous crimes that Andrew put up on the screen there. I'm a fierce privacy protagonist, and that I believe in the right to anonymity, and if you don't have that, and if you don't have freedom of association, if you don't have freedom of speech, it's not those hideous crimes that you're going to be talking about, it's a breakdown of democracy. Now, of course, I'm using an extreme argument to make my point in the same way that Andrew does. So I worry that binding a strong digital identity and giving the end user no choice but to have one, and linking that to face, that's a serious concern to me. And bearing in mind, we're just coming out of what Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism, where the big tech companies had pseudo-identities about us, and we're probably 5 years post that now. Some people believe that if we move that into a government-controlled ID, that's like moving from the frying pan to the fire.
The one thing I will say is, in this moment, there is a fierce argument going on in Washington, D.C., in which a private company called ID.me is busily running the digital identity assurance and operation on behalf of the IRS and states. And half of the American Congress is saying, this is an absolute scandal. This should only be run by government.
Yeah. And who's right, who's wrong? It's difficult to pick out. And also on the face thing, Andrew, you positioned the difference between identity and verification really nicely at the start. But I remember coming to Mobile World Congress about 5 years ago, and there must have been about 20 companies, and you'd be walking down Congress Square and there'd be your face highlighted and people would be pinging. That is the political framework in which people are looking at facial technology, and that's worrying. I believe in facial recognition and verification. I also believe in digital ID, but there's a risk if it's pushed too hard now, it will get killed.
I agree completely. There I agree absolutely completely, Lee, and the real risk that we're running, and again, this is a growing threat to our industry, is that the sheer subversive creepiness of facial recognition, of being identified by your face, which is, to me, unconscionable and unacceptable. I'm with you on that. That somehow that leaks in and poisons the ethically completely different activity of facial verification, in which I say, I am Andrew Budd, and my face is used to confirm what I've done. We say, if you know about it, if you consent to it, if you gain personal benefit from it, and if your privacy is protected, then those are the attributes of facial verification that make it so ethically completely different from facial recognition, from facial identification. And I think one of the tasks that behooves our industry is to carve a difference, is to carve an abyss between the world of face verification, which is a fantastic liberator to billions of people, and the creepiness of walking down the street and being recognized without knowing, without consenting, without getting any personal benefit, and in a complete violation of your privacy.
So you're on the front line of that, Andrew, and you're obviously the last 2 years, I'm sure you've had a lot of conversations with politicians and regulators and so on. How would you characterize their level of understanding of the point you've just made about the difference between using your face to verify and external agencies recognizing your face as you walk down the street?
This is a challenge for our industry. On the one hand, I presented in the UK to the all-party parliamentary group on digital identity, and I made this point with the usual reserve and diplomatic tact that I've just used, and the Lord, whoever it was, who's the chairman, said, "You've made your point very strongly, Andrew. I can't understand why you're so passionate about it. Surely no one would ever confuse these two." Almost exactly his words. At the same time, at this moment, there are editorials in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, And there are statements and there are questions being raised in Congress in which these two are completely conflated together. And I think the difference is one of education and explanation to lawmakers, regulators, and staffers. This isn't about the general public. Studies show that if you offer the general public the opportunity to use their face to verify and simplify their lives, something like 97% of people will do it. So this is not about educating the public. The public, the statistics show that the public actually doesn't care very much, but this is about educating regulators and politicians. And it's a very live topic at the moment, as you point out, Tim.
I think we might, I'm not sure, can you tell me if we've got any more time left, or? Huh? Yeah, a couple of minutes. So if anyone's got a question and they want to ask, to go up to the mics, it's, I was saying before, I went to a session at CTIA a few years ago, and they were handing out lagers before you were allowed to ask a question, so that elicited a bit more response, but I don't think we've got any lager, so anyway, I'll just ask one more question to finish it off. Okay. It's a bit of a cliched naff one, but might as well ask it anyway. What do you think the digital identity, the predominant digital identity, authentication, I should say, method will be in 5 years?
We've been predicting the demise of SMS OTP. I just showed you it working fabulously well, bearing in mind I'm roaming. Of all of the proof of possession technologies that are out there, on a global basis, it's still performing the best. There's things like FIDO2. From a public key cryptography perspective, it's a stronger security model, but I talk about...
Can you just explain what FIDO2 is for anyone who doesn't understand?
Yeah, so this is the ability to put an asymmetric key in your browser or on your device. But if you're going to use that, you need to be able to wake those keys up in any user experience. And that's the problem. Waking them up can be a clumsy user experience for the customer. The other issue with all these stronger issues is key management. I shared a story with Andrew last week. I, many years ago, was installing a public key cryptography solution for a bank. 10 years after I did the install, the Chief Information Officer phoned me up and said, "Lee, have you got the password for our certificate authority?" And I did have a WTF moment with him. So there are some interesting models up there, but I don't think they'll have the scale that
Andrew?
SMS does.
So I, as the founder of mBlocks, I confidently predicted the demise of SMS by about 2020. Reports of its death have been more than somewhat exaggerated. So anybody who says that this is going to go away, I think is probably betting on the wrong side. At the same time, I am fascinated by the increasing number of businesses that are being founded to do back-end lookups of phone, silent lookups of phone numbers, using header enrichment or IPification, as we saw at the MEFIs last night, or any of these people who are able to accomplish the same goal as SMS OTP, but in what I would describe as a more elegant and more sophisticated way. And those are quite appealing. I think we are going to see increasing use of embedded credentials in the phone, because the phones are increasingly acquiring secure enclaves and so on. So I think we'll see a bit of a hodgepodge, but I am curious about the evolution from SMS OTP to other forms of phone number lookup, and I'm convinced that that will always be combined with some form of facial biometric check, which may be which may have more or less strong liveness associated with it. Lee said, you've got to calibrate what you do. We protected the California unemployment benefits system against $30 billion of fraud. You know what? The fraudsters tried pretty hard. If you're renting a scooter, as we saw in the first presentation, probably you don't need to have liveness protection of such a high quality, because there's no point in attacking it with any great vigor. So there will be scale levels of liveness assurance, which is the core of the security of these systems, combined with a variety of different but I will say that's authentication. In terms of the future of identity, I want to come back to verifiable credentials. Those of you who haven't heard about JSON LD with BBS Plus probably need to start finding out about it, because I think in 4 years that's going to, that alphabet soup is going to be pretty much all we're talking about in the world of digital identity.
There's so many exciting things that we didn't get to talk about. So we didn't talk about metadata. We'd love to talk more about verified credentials. I had a fun story about liability on verified credentials that we want to share, but I think we're
we've barely scratched the surface. There's obviously plenty of resources on the MEF website. They have an identity group there, so you can go and find out further information there. We don't have any more time, I'm afraid, so I'd like to thank Lee and Andrew for all of their wisdom, and I'd like to thank you for paying attention at this late hour, and stay tuned for the RCS session next. So thank you very much. Bye.